Yeah, it's obviously bad news for the Wild. As my colleague Mike Russo and I at the Athletic first reported on Tuesday morning that um, the Wild were considering surgery for Kirill Kaprizov, and they end up scheduling it for later this week for their star winger, who has been dealing with that lower body injury, as you know, since the Christmas break, and he tried as much as he could to rehab it and take his time and get back, but as John Hyden said, he was just uncomfortable each game. He was probably around 60% in both conversations with himself, the team, doctors. Just made a decision that he will have surgery that will put him out minimum, as Bill Guerin said, 4 weeks. So it could be the 4 to 6 week range, which does mean they get a break here because the Four Nations tournament will take 2 weeks of that. So that's kind of fortuitous timing for that, but it's not fortuitous timing in the sense that this won't mean there'll be this big, huge splash at the trade deadline because he's expected back before the end of the regular season. So there's good news and bad news with that. You can't find somebody that can replace Kirill Kaprizov internally from Iowa or whatever, and you can't go out and get somebody with the cap space that they have. So, but it's essentially that they want to make sure that he's 100% ready to go. They gave it a shot at the rehab side, and Kirill wanted to come back as soon as he possibly could. But you can just tell, as dangerous as he is, he wasn't quite as explosive the last few games, and now you know why.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of fans are going to be mad, like, oh, have him sit out. We want to be able to bring someone else in, pull the Vegas, pull the Tampa. Like, reality is, you want Kaprizov back for as many of those games as possible if you even want to have a shot of getting into the playoffs. Like, is that a concern? Do you see? Maybe not like trying to replace Kaprizov because, like you said, we aren't going to be able to have the LTIR covered through the end of the year. But does this change Guerin's plans for how he's going to approach the trade deadline?
Well, as of now, it doesn't because he won't have a lot of space to do much, right? And I know people want him to pull a Tampa or a Vegas or whatnot, but the fact of the matter is, at this point, especially without Kaprizov for the next 4 weeks, they're going to be fighting it just to make the playoffs, with the way things are going right now. And so I think if you're going to say, sit him the rest of the post deadline game, which is about 19 or 17 games, like that's a lot of points to be risking there to be quote unquote having him sit out, which they wouldn't do any. I don't think Kirill Kaprizov, people forget the players don't want to just sit out, right. They're not going to sit out for some sort of fake injury. They want to play, and he's as competitive as a player as I've ever been around. So that's kind of the bad news for fans who want to do armchair GM and get whoever else at the deadline, Besser or Nelson or Miller or whatever. But this obviously the big story is that the top player for the Minnesota Wild will be out at least 4 weeks after surgery. And the good news is that he's, in theory, he'll be back to 100%, back to his usual self, and with plenty of runway left for the regular season, and then be good to go for the playoffs, assuming that the Wild make it. I know a question that we all had was, did they consider surgery sooner, like back in late December when he was going through that? And Bill Guerin said today that, surgery is usually the last resort, kind of an invasive procedure. There was a thought that, he could come back and take his time to rehab it and play, which I agree from up, it's easier for us to say to just go have surgery, not having to go through it yourself. So, but yeah, that was one thing where potentially they could have, got taken care of beforehand and him being back by now or whatever. But that was the case where they felt at that particular point that going through this rehab route would get him back and be able to play versus the surgery. And now they decided, instead of pushing it even more and having him play at 60%, to shut it down and have him have the procedure and get him back sooner than they can.
From what you guys have been able to surmise on this, Joe, do you get any sense that the reason that they made the decision, it's happening this week, has any influence from Four Nations being like, hey, if we're going to do this, we got to get this in and get it started so that there is that couple week, layover where he's not missing games? Like, we're talking about missing 4 to 6 weeks, and that's maybe 10, 12 games more than likely, which is very fortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably part of the calculus, but I think a big part of the reason is kind of how he felt coming back. Sure. And if he had felt 100% great coming back, or if there was no issues, or he could play through it and still be his usual Kirill, I think they wouldn't have done it. But I think the fact that I think John Hines said today that he was, uncomfortable and that he struggled to get through things when he was on the bench. So like, when you have a guy like who's your main superstar, a guy that can carry you a lot of games, dealing with that, even though at 60%, Kirill Kaprizov is better than a lot of players in the NHL, that's not a way to kind of knowing that your season could be quite a bit longer here if you go where the team wants to go. So, but I do think that the timing of this, both him not feeling well and number two, knowing that you have this break coming ahead makes more sense than anything else to get it done sooner than later.